I want to make this video entirely about private property and property, at least under capitalism. As far as we citizens under capitalism in the United States, UK, France, etc., the entirety of capitalism, like the entire world of capitalism, lives under, and kind of like the whole problem of kind of how property is essentially bought and distributed as well to like upon it under the means of distribution and means of consumption under capitalism of property and land. And I just want to get onto that today. So let's get started. First, before we get onto private property under capitalism, we have to define private property, or at least in part, and we have to make sure the difference, like what kind of private property I'm talking about. Um, there's a lot of things that there's a lot of things that a lot of capitalists essentially get wrong. Is that private property is essentially property that you personally like own and that you have, and it's private specifically to you. Like, let's say your house, your computer, your camera, your coffee maker, your whatever a machine or automation or some sort of product that you bought is essentially yours, and that to them that's private property, which is not the case. That definition is mainly personal property, property that you essentially bought for the essentially everything that you own. Personal property is mere private, like personal property is essentially just a commodity for yourself, for your own personal use entirely. It's really only the time when that kind of property is essentially sold onto the market, or essentially if it's land being bought for the sake of production, that's entirely private property. And yeah, private property is usually property private property is usually property that is being bought for the sake of private production, owned by a landowner, a boss, some sort of landlord, in any way whatsoever. And it's usually been practiced under the times of feudalism, where agriculture was considered as a necessity. And so for kings and lords to essentially get profit out of the peasantry, they would buy land and make the peasantry work on that land, so that way they can produce grain, wheat, so that way they can produce bread, and bread can be distributed to the people, and yee da da. But the more the goods, you essentially go to the landlords, to the kings, to the guilds, and even then you still had goods that were essentially sold by merchants. And even then, what we're going to talk about today under capitalism, with the entire mode of production evolving and automation being a new thing entirely within our economical structure. And what you have to realize is that private property still exists today. There's still agricultural production, obviously, and essentially people are still buying property for the sake of production, for their own personal use, for their own profits, right? Like, let's say a farmer essentially would essentially buy land for production, and he would essentially use that for his own production. That's entirely fine. However, if other people need to produce as well and need food, like let's say under entirely of a communist society, higher fares of communism, to each according to their ability, to each according to their need. They should entirely have they should and typically do have the right to essentially produce upon that land. However, under capitalism, right? You can't have that. You essentially is based on the production of the former, of the entirely of the landlord, of the boss, the higher up of production. And this is the case entirely. So what we have to understand here is that because of this entire system, right? A lot of people can't really get their goods and can't really essentially get what they need entirely based upon to the system. What later happens is essentially that the person that owns that land, the person that essentially owns that land, buys that land for the sake of production, essentially has to employ multiple people to work on under that land, and then those people essentially get paid a wage, and it's usually like the lowest amount possible for someone to essentially work. So that way they keep buying labor and keep buying labor and keep buying essentially work for that laborer. This is one thing that I have to understand, right? Is that this system is entirely ineffective, because one, it doesn't actually bring innovation, doesn't bring any form of actual productive forces, only really productive forces for a minority, and the fact that it only brings productive forces for a minority instead of to the actual majority giving actually giving their labor, essentially selling their labor entirely, is very ineffective. It's a very ineffective system. Number two, number two, uh, private private property has existed for a very very long time, and even then has very much destroyed it. Of course, not talking about personal property like your computer and all that, but private property being bought for the sake of production, for the sake of workers to produce any product or any grain or any food upon that. And even then, that food is essentially supposed to be sold on a market instead of based upon to the needs of others, which is, I would say, yeah, highly ineffective. And you can even see upon this, right? Because of that entire system, it causes an economic collapse. Economic collapse causes inflation, poverty, unemployment, and so much more. The worst part is that if you are considered essentially of a commodity under this kind of production forces, so if let's say like the boss doesn't want you anymore, he can essentially just drop you whenever he wants to. It's just fucked entirely. And even then, when essentially products are produced under private property, like private lands, let's say bread, it's usually of a lower quality than ones on public property, ones that's actually allowing for workers themselves to essentially communally produce what they want, compared. But even then, this is usually considered as a bad practice to bourgeois economists that seek it, because it doesn't sustain onto the actual market, even though the market can't sustain itself anyways. So what the hell is the point? Upon this, right? Um, this is the entirety of the problem of private property, and why it should be abolished, especially now more than ever. I mean, you can claim that you like that private property and private production creates an innovation, but clearly it does not. You essentially under entire private property, you still have to follow orders from a landlord or from a boss or from some sort of employer status, to the point where essentially it's not bringing innovation or creativity. It's bringing more and more of essentially do as I say kind of dichotomy. And you can even say onto like more industrialized jobs, oh, you do have to have like some creativity. Like let's say an office job, you have to file papers, essentially create some sort of tactic onto like helping a business, helping your boss entirely. And yeah, you know so you can say that is the case, but even then, like under the private sector, but even then, right? You usually still don't like essentially get paid enough, and even then, it's only a creativity for the entirety of your boss, not onto the actual creativity on what the people need, what the people really needs entirely, because and the corporate interests of the few doesn't actually have the interests of the public. It really doesn't. And even then if they really did, then there wouldn't be no need to essentially buy labor. If that was the case, there would be no need for any private production. There'd be no need for any private property at all. And that's the problem. And this is the entirety of the problem of private property. Not only does it actually not bring any quality of products. It has horrible pay. It has horrible interest for the workers. It doesn't actually it barely even has any interest onto the workers. And even then, private property is like one of the worst economic implementations into our modern structure. It brings inflation, it brings economic crisis, and it just essentially all of it is just very ineffective onto the actual structure and the actual purpose of the work for the working class. So we have to ask ourselves, what is the best conclusion for this to happen? I'd say the best conclusion for us to happen, for us to do as entirely of the people, entirely as people, is to essentially abolish this whole private property system, abolish this whole entire private production system, and essentially establish a production system based onto the public. Essentially, of a worker state, correct? I've already talked about this multiple times, but essentially the workers themselves taking control upon to that production. Essentially, making that property public, so that way innovation can increase onto all sides. Quality can increase because it has been proven that quality does increase upon public property. Um, if it's onto communal owns onto that communal owned systems, give essentially give production based onto the need of others, have a distribution onto the needs of others, uh, help people that essentially need it most, help the lower class, and essentially do whatever we can to essentially abolish the system, because we can even look at the entire system itself. It's not very productive at all. It was very much is not. It's very ineffective entirely. Um, thus because of this, we can't really actually do anything upon it other than really just being essentially of a economical system that's essentially just failing, and will continue to fail unless if we actually ourselves, we as working class citizens, can go upon ourselves and actually uh, take hold and actually abolish this entire system and create a worker state entirely, which is even better. But even then, that worker state must have the goal to go to socialism and communism as a moneyless, classless, stateless society. Um, yeah, and even then, I know some socialists might even disagree. Quote unquote socialists might even disagree that socialism is a moneyless, classless society. Well, according to Marx, it was, and so is Lenin. And I've already made a video upon that. Yeah. The best way we can actually help this system is essentially public property. So in conclusion, right, we have to understand ourselves. Private property doesn't actually serve onto the interests of the public. Doesn't bring innovation. Doesn't bring any quality of products. It doesn't bring anything new to the table. It creates economic crisis, inflation, unemployment, and so much more. It would be better to have a communalized distribution system, public property, upon to public property, that being production, for all workers themselves to essentially produce goods, essentially for themselves, having the state being controlled by the entirety of the working class, having you know the entirety of the system being the entirety of the system being communalized, property being handed to the working class, no private property whatsoever. Not to be confused with personal property. That personal property is essentially products that you own for your own use entirely. Private property being property that is essentially bought for the sake of production, usually under feudalism or capitalism, or even slavery. So that's really the entirety of the measures that I say entirely. Private property is bad. Public property would be better entirely onto the productive forces, because it actually brings quality to products and actually gives upon to the actual needs and and to the actual implications and innovation for the working class themselves, instead of based upon to a minority, which upon to that minority is very, very insufficient and very, very ineffective as well. Uh, yeah. Thank you for watching this video. If you liked the video, then hit the like button down below. I'd very much appreciate it. If you're new to my channel, hit the subscribe button. I would also very much appreciate it. I've decided to make this video because, decided to make a video against capitalism, private property specifically. I'll probably make more of kind of like these videos as well, or I might make more videos upon talking about Marxist theory. Yeah. Anyways, hope you enjoyed this video. Socialist Links is out.